I let Sarah know that my seminar wrapped up a day earlier than expected, but since I couldn't change my flight, I'd still be getting back on Tuesday night. She was supposed to pick me up at the airport around 6 p.m. When I told her, she sounded a bit irritated that I'd be away for one more night, but she said she was looking forward to seeing me. After thinking about it for a while, I realized I had been traveling a lot recently, and maybe it was time I put more focus on my wife, who I'd been with for 17 years. So, I headed to the airport to see if I could change my plans. I almost decided against it, but then I spotted a flight to an airport near our hometown. Normally, I fly into an airport about an hour north of where we live, but this other one was nearly 2 hours to the south, and I'd never flown into it before. I checked, and there was a flight leaving in just half an hour. I went up to the counter and bought a ticket. It was surprisingly easy. In less than an hour, I was in the air, and about 3 hours later, I landed. I rented a car, expecting to be home by midnight, and I couldn't wait to see Sarah's reaction to my early return. On the drive, I imagined how she might show her excitement, and I smiled to myself at the thought. I chose not to call her, wanting to make my return a total surprise. It was just before midnight when I arrived at the house. The place was completely dark, and Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway. I thought that was odd, but I didn't let it get to me right away. I brought my bags inside, unpacked, and started wondering where she could be at this hour. I didn't want to jump to any conclusions, so I called her cell phone. She answered on the third ring, and I casually asked how she was. She said she'd been a Zethamp since it was so late, and assured me she'd be at the airport to pick me up at 6 a.m. Something about that didn't feel right. She said she was a Zethamp, but she wasn't home. Trying not to seem suspicious, I asked where she was, mentioning that I'd tried calling the house phone and got the answering machine. She told me she was in bed, but that the house phone wasn't working and a repairman was scheduled to fix it the next day. As I stood there, unpacking, my mind raced. Was she really in bed upstairs? I'd been moving around the house and hadn't seen her. It didn't make sense, but I didn't want to believe she was lying outright. Still, I couldn't help but wonder why things felt so off. I told her I wouldn't be on the 6 a.m. flight after all, and that I'd be staying a few more days. I promised to call when I had my new flight details. She told me she missed me and wanted me to come home as soon as possible. I echoed her words, though something in my gut felt wrong. When we said goodbye, I noticed a slight laugh in her voice, which only added to my doubts. After hanging up, I dialed our home phone again, and sure enough, it rang. Normally, I would have found that amusing and joked with myself about it, but this time I wasn't in the mood. I went upstairs, searched the bedroom, looked under the bed, and checked other places. I was starting to feel like a fool. My instincts were sharp, though, and something told me this wasn't right. I'd been pretty naive, that much was clear. The next morning, I got up early and moved the rental car to the other side of the street, trying to stay out of sight. Around 7 a.m., I saw Sarah's car pull up, but she wasn't the one driving. A man was behind the wheel. I quickly hid in the foyer closet, leaving the door cracked open just enough to see. Sarah came in, unlocking the door, and the man followed her inside. She casually told him she needed to change and grab some clothes for work, saying she'd pack for the next day to avoid coming back in the morning. He laughed and said he'd help her with that, but only if they could fool around again afterward. Sarah, always playful, joked that she might have to fire him for being late, and teased him about how much he enjoyed being her boss. They laughed together, like this was all some big joke. Sarah even mentioned how his wife thought she was the perfect secretary, and I couldn't help but wonder what his wife would think if she knew the truth. This guy hadn't even been at the company that long, maybe a couple of weeks, and yet here they were, all cozy. He laughed and said he'd already told his wife about Sarah, making a crude joke about how she was the same age as his mother-in-law but a lot skinnier. He even joked that his wife would fire her if she ever saw her. He also mentioned that he'd told his wife he was out house hunting, using that as an excuse to stay away from the hotel for a few days. When Sarah rejoined him, they laughed some more, and she looked all dolled up, like she was trying to impress him. They kissed slowly, and I stood there, tempted to grab something, maybe an umbrella, and put an end to it right then and there. But I held back. He suggested they spend the night together, go out for dinner, and maybe check out a lodge he knew about. Sarah liked the idea, but she playfully asked what they'd do if I came home early. The guy, his name was Daniel, didn't seem too concerned. He reassured her that I'd call him to arrange an airport pickup with plenty of notice, and if I didn't call today, I wouldn't be back tomorrow. That seemed to ease her worries, and she joked that even if I did catch them, I'd probably just offer Daniel a beer and apologize for the trouble. Daniel laughed and said I sounded like an easygoing guy, but added that his wife would probably lose her mind if she ever found out he was cheating. Sarah chuckled, saying that most men were kept in line by fear, though Daniel didn't seem too afraid of his wife. Daniel agreed, but he added that if his wife did find out, he'd be in serious trouble. He mentioned that his wife was in Houston, so he felt safe for the moment. That's when I stopped listening. I'd heard enough. My face flushed with anger, and I could feel my blood pressure spike. Not only had Sarah been cheating on me, but it was clear she didn't even like me anymore. I sat down, trying to process everything, and slowly a plan started to form in my mind. I remembered that Sarah had mentioned her new boss had transferred from the company's headquarters in Houston. I needed to know more about him, so I made a few phone calls. After asking a few subtle questions to the receptionist at Sarah's office, I got the information I needed. His name was Daniel Baker, and he had a wife and 2 teenage kids. His family was staying in Texas until the school year finished, after which they'd all be moving to Springfield. In the meantime, he was supposedly searching for a house every night after work. I did a quick search online for anyone named Baker in Houston and found 3 Daniel Bakers listed. On my first call, I got lucky. I asked if she was Mrs. Daniel Baker, and when she confirmed, I told her I was from Halifax, her husband's company. I introduced myself as Mark Harris and said we were planning a small surprise party for Daniel and her, complete with round-trip tickets to Springfield. She was pleased with the idea and asked when the party would be. I avoided giving her a solid date, just saying it would be the next night. I gave her flight details, explaining that the company would reimburse Daniel for the travel expenses. I emphasized that the event was a surprise and asked her to keep it a secret, to which she readily agreed. Next, I reached out to Sarah's friends and family, inviting them to a surprise party for Sarah, under the pretense that she had received a promotion at work. Everyone loved the idea, and they were all eager to celebrate. I told them to be at our house by 7 p.m., ensuring that Sarah would be there. To make the party special, I arranged for food and drinks from a local restaurant to be set up on our veranda, right by the pool. Sarah had always dreamed of having a party out there, so I figured it would be a nice touch. I left instructions with the caterers to set everything up, even if the house was empty when they arrived. The next day, I got to the airport about half an hour early. As the passengers from Houston started coming through, I approached a couple of women, asking if they were Mrs. Baker. After a brief conversation with one, I heard someone call my name. It was her. She looked like a movie star, almost too polished to be real. Trying to play it cool, I introduced myself as Ron and mentioned that my wife worked for her husband. She seemed a bit skeptical, so I made a joke about how people often said I married an older and larger woman, but I reassured her it was just because my wife had more experience and was easy to love. After a moment, she smiled, and I felt relieved. We grabbed her luggage and headed to the parking lot. When we arrived at my house around 6:30, I told Mrs. Baker it was an outdoor party in her husband's honor, and also to celebrate my wife's birthday. As the guests began to arrive, I looked around, impressed by how seamlessly everything had come together. The veranda looked perfect, and by 7:30, everyone I invited had arrived. I had asked them to park behind the church a block away so the driveway would be clear. I explained the plan. When Sarah and Daniel arrived, I would turn off the patio lights, signaling everyone to stay quiet. We had large sliding glass doors that led to the veranda, with vertical blinds that could be opened with cords. I also had heavy curtains we used in winter, and I decided that hiding behind them would be the best spot. From there, I could reach the cords to control the blinds and switch off the lights on the veranda. Just before 8 p.m., I saw Sarah's car pull up. I turned off the lights on the deck and hid behind the curtains, making sure the house was completely silent. The front door opened, and I heard Sarah and Daniel laughing as they entered. Daniel was joking about how little private time they managed to get, and Sarah was giggling right along with him. He helped her out of her dress, leaving her in nothing but a thong. They seemed to be having the time of their lives, and then, without a care in the world, Sarah stripped off her thong. She teased Daniel about how he was always in a playful mood, and he responded by pushing her onto my chair. I watched in silence as they started up their affair right there in my living room. That's when I decided enough was enough. I flipped the lights back on. Sarah jumped up, shocked, and immediately demanded to know what I was doing there. Her question seemed absurd under the circumstances. I calmly reminded her that this was, in fact, my house, and my name was on the deed. She acted surprised that I'd come home early, but I simply shrugged. Daniel, looking panicked, muttered something about needing to leave, saying he had other things to take care of. I offered him a drink, and both he and Sarah stared at me, dumbfounded. I could tell Daniel was trying to process Sarah's earlier remark about me being the kind of guy who'd just offer him a beer if I ever caught them together. I couldn't help but smirk as I watched him squirm. Before he could reply, the door to the veranda swung open, and Mrs. Baker stormed in, her large purse swinging wildly. She was about to add her own surprise to the night's events. His shock left him practically defenseless, and he ended up about 5 feet from where he had been standing. Shortly after, Sarah's mother and sister joined the scene. Sarah, still naked, got a scolding from her mother, who told her to get dressed and made a half-joking comment that she should consider a career in adult entertainment after her little performance. Sarah was too stunned to respond, and once I turned on the porch light, she realized about 20 people were staring at her. I walked outside, grabbed some potato salad and wings, and pulled a can of beer from the fridge. I sat back down and watched as Daniel struggled to find a seat, while Sarah tried to pull herself together. The whole situation was frustrating, but I couldn't help feeling like none of this was my fault. Sarah and Daniel had brought this on themselves and their families. In the end, maybe it was for the best that everyone knew the truth so we could all move forward. As the chaos started to settle, Sarah's cousin offered to take Mrs. Baker to the motel, while another cousin helped Daniel to the car and drove him to the same place. Sarah's mom asked if she wanted to go with them, but Sarah declined. Her mother acknowledged that I was probably upset, saying that Sarah deserved a good scolding but figured she was already feeling the consequences. Then they left. Sarah hid in the bathroom, and I heard the shower running. Honestly, I had never enjoyed beer and wings so much. Sitting there alone, thinking about everything that had just happened, I couldn't help but feel like, once or twice in life, everything lines up perfectly and a plan just works. After finishing my food, I started cleaning up. Cleaning up after this group took some time. I had to put all the leftovers in the fridge and freezer. It was well past midnight when I sat back down at the table with my last beer of the evening, finally able to relax. Sarah came out and sat down AC Baker from me. I asked her if she was happy, if this is what she really wanted. I started wondering why people even get these kinds of ideas. Had I marked something to make them think that way? Or was it her? She brought up the time I got caught with my boss, wondering aloud if anyone would assume she was that kind of woman. Sarah then lashed out at me, upset that I didn't come to her directly if we had any issues, instead of inviting the whole neighborhood over. I grinned and asked her if she thought we had a problem. She continued, saying she never meant to be hurtful and hadn't thought I'd ever find out about my boss. She even went as far as to accuse me of deliberately hurting her. I pointed out that throwing a surprise party for my beloved wife in our home wasn't exactly worse than her stepping out on me. I added that most people wouldn't see things the way she did. Finally, she said the thing I'd been waiting to hear all this time. Sarah claimed that if I'd been around more, none of this would have happened, that I hadn't paid enough attention to her, and that's why she was vulnerable to Daniel's advances. I just laughed. She was actually trying to blame me and get me to apologize for her own actions. She looked completely ridiculous to me. As I closed the bedroom door behind me and locked it, a deep sense of satisfaction came over me. The chains had finally been broken. I was emotionally free, and soon enough I'd be legally free too. Couldn't wait to start my new life. It was funny to think that just earlier, I should have been at work, feeling stressed out like any other day. But here I was now, surprisingly calm, sitting at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee. I needed it to calm my nerves. This was always a comforting routine for me. When our kids were younger, I'd wake up an hour before everyone else just to enjoy the peace and quiet. It had become kind of a hobby. I'm Evan Carter. I've been happily married for 25 years. Well, I was happily married until a couple of hours ago. We've got 4 kids, and the last one left the house last year. Laura, my wife, seemed to be struggling with what she called empty nest syndrome. So I encouraged her to find a hobby. I guess she found one earlier today. I never caught the guy's name, though. She just kept calling him Stallion and cheering him on with things like, "Do it, Stallion. Come on. Baby, I know you can do it." What was strange was that the smell of my favorite coffee, filling the house, didn't interrupt them. Normally, whenever I brewed coffee, Laura would rush downstairs before it even finished. But this time, she was too busy to notice. I heard them exchange more words, Laura asking him to tell her how much better he was than her spineless husband, and him happily agreeing, saying, "Oh my God, you're so much better." I thought about flicking the safety off my gun, just in case. After all, her new lover was a cop. I knew that because when I walked in earlier, his uniform and gear belt were scattered AC Baker my living room floor, right next to all of my wife's clothes. Their conversation continued. "That's it, baby. Do it for me. Harder," Laura moaned. The constant creaking of the bed and the steady thumping of the headboard against the wall made it hard to focus on what I was doing. But judging by how long they'd been at it, I figured I still had plenty of time. It was clear this wasn't their first time together. I overheard Laura mentioning she wanted more, that they should make this a regular thing. "Damn it, baby. We need to find a way to meet 2 or 3 times a week instead of just occasionally." Those were the words from my beloved wife, or at least I think that's what she said. How did I end up in the middle of this nightmare? It was really stupid. I went to work but realized I forgot my briefcase. Actually, I had left it in the garage because I put it down to rescue the cat from under the car's hood and completely forgot about it. Tabby is our second cat. Years ago, on a cold winter morning, I didn't tap on the hood before starting the car, and that was the end of Clarence, our first cat. There's nothing quite like the noise a cat makes when it gets caught in a fan belt spinning at 1,000 RPMs, fur flying everywhere. Clarence wasn't smart enough, and neither was I. "You're never going to let that weakling of a husband touch you again, are you?" "No," she replied. "He'll never touch me again, I swear." Honestly, my briefcase wasn't that important, so I thought about just leaving it behind. But as fate would have it, my client drove me straight to my house. That's when I saw it. A black and white police car parked out front. I felt like I'd been stabbed right in the chest. My first thought was that something horrible must have happened to my loyal wife. I pulled into the driveway, barely missing my wife's brand new silver Lexus LS, but her garden gnome wasn't so lucky. I didn't even shut the car door before running inside, and that's how I ended up here, sipping coffee and watching this mess unfold. "Take me now, stud. Make me feel good," my wife moaned. God, I've never felt anything like this before. The whole thing was disgusting, and I really wanted a glass of whiskey instead of coffee, but I figured I'd need to keep a clear head. I have to admit, hearing their wild screams was disturbing enough, but seeing it with my own eyes made it even worse. But I had to witness it to get the video and audio evidence. Honestly, though, watching them roll around in my bed wasn't the worst part. The most humiliating thing was hearing my wife insult me while they were at it. "God, you're so much better than Evan. Give it to me, baby. All of it." That seemed to spur him on, because soon the whole house was shaking along with the bed. His grunts and curses got even louder. Let me tell you, it's a shock when your wife amps with another man in your marital bed. And yes, they were doing it on my side. My wife was breathlessly riding him like some cowboy, telling him how much it turned her on. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to the bathroom, bent over the toilet, and threw up my breakfast. I was surprised they didn't hear me or smell it, but I guess they were too focused on their little adventure. Part of me still couldn't believe it, even though I had more than enough evidence to convince a jury. But my wife was 50, and this guy couldn't have been more than 30. He was in great shape, and my wife didn't stand a chance against him. I may not be the most macho guy, but really, why go for someone else's wife who's in good shape? It didn't make any sense. It felt like it went on forever, but after about 90 minutes, it suddenly got quiet. I figured they'd finally taken a break. That's when I heard my wife say, "What's that smell?" Her boyfriend didn't answer. Then I heard her gasp, "Oh my God." There was a lot of scrambling after that. Closet doors opening, drawers slamming shut, laundry baskets being shuffled around. I assumed they were trying to clean up any trace of what they'd mark. I made a mental note to get tested for STDs. When they finally saw me, Laura gasped. Her lover looked equally shocked. He glanced at his uniform and then back at me, clearly dejected. "It's not there, stud," my wife told him. "What?" he asked, confused. "Your service weapon. Your boss took it with him when he left." Thoughtful guy, really? He looked like he was about to disappear right in front of me. His lips started quivering with desperation. He dropped to his knees, losing the sheet in the process, and began frantically searching through the pile of clothes on the floor. "He took this too," she said, holding up what I assumed was his backup weapon. "I think he called it your throwing arm." The realization that the serial number had been removed seemed to crush him. "That's 5 to 7 years right there," she added. Former Officer Blake Carter looked devastated. "Like I said, your boss is a thoughtful guy. We had a nice little chat while you two lovebirds were having fun upstairs." Laura shot a quick glance out the window. "Yes, he took the patrol car too," I said. "Your boss mentioned you were on duty providing security at the construction site. He was going to take your uniform as well, but he figured you'd need it when you leave here." Laura's face paled. But where will he go?" she stammered. "Well," I replied, "he could call his wife for a ride home, but probably not. She's pretty upset about that video I emailed her. I'm not sure what she said, but it sounded like something to do with her father, who, by the way, is the chief of police." Laura looked horrified. "How could you do that? To your kids? You seem like a nice family," I said, "but I was just reeling you in at that point." Then I added, "I'd ask Laura to drive you home, but her car's been impounded." "What?" Laura squealed. "Yeah, they found a couple of ounces of unaccounted for weed in the front seat. Sergeant Mark told me they usually just issue a ticket, but he figured they owed me something after all the trouble the department caused. Marked worry. You'll probably get the car back in a few days once they finish the forensics." "Oh my God," Laura groaned. By now, she wasn't screaming. It was more of a sad, defeated moan, like a lonely dog howling at the moon. "Well, officer, I think it's time for you to put on your uniform and leave," I said. So he did. After he was gone, my wife finally found her voice. "Please, Evan, I love you. It didn't mean anything. It was just a fling or something like that. Oh man, I wish you'd told me that sooner. I was worried you loved him and were going to divorce me. Now I feel bad. Did I overreact? You know I love you, Evan. Of course I love you. Why would you doubt that?" "Well, aside from the whole infidelity thing, you know, making love to your lover on my side of the bed, and calling me a stupid idiot covered in crayon, there were a few other signs." "Oh honey, I never actually meant that. It was just bedroom talk to get us in the mood." "Wait. You said I overreacted. Evan, what did you do?" She looked annoyed now. "Evan, what did you do?" she asked again. Up until now, she'd been in shock, but I could see the shift. Now she was nervous, paying close attention. "Well, I'm sorry, but just when I thought you didn't love me anymore, I sent the video to our kids. I just wanted them to see who their new daddy might be. You might want to wait a while before you call them. They seemed upset for some reason. I thought they'd be happy for you. Well, that's what I did." "Oh my God. You didn't." I just nodded. "Yeah, I did. And oh, one more thing, you probably already know this, but your lover's wife works at the same company as you. She's the executive assistant to the CEO, if I recall correctly. Marked worry, I told her not to fire you, since you'll still need your job, even if they transfer you to Little Rock. By the way, my attorney mentioned that since you make more money than I do, you'll be paying me alimony. She estimated about $3,000 a month for the next few years. I added, I know a lot of guys wouldn't take it, the macho types. But not me. I'm planning to take some time off work and go on a long fishing trip to deal with the pain. Like the song says, deep sea fishing with a señorita in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not exactly sure why my lawyer asked for a picture of you. She mentioned something about giving it to your father, but maybe it was just for the cops in case they need to engage in bad things. Or maybe it's for someone else interested in you. I marked no, but I gave her one. I continued, oh, and I also sent the video to your mom and dad, as well as a few of your colleagues. Why are you being so harsh, Evan? Well, honey, I wasn't trying to be harsh. I just thought everyone should know who your new partner is. Your friends on Facebook seemed happy for you. By this point, Laura had practically shut down. She sat on the floor, wrapped in a sheet, crying and shaking her head, murmuring, "This can't be happening to me. All right, dear. It's time to get dressed and pack your bag. Your parents should be here soon to pick you up." "Pick me up?" she asked, looking bewildered. "Well, of course. You'll need somewhere to stay. The house will have to be sold as part of the divorce. Remember? Divorce." She looked stunned, like she couldn't quite believe what was happening. "You seem surprised," I said. "What exactly did you expect to happen when I found out?" "Oh wait, you didn't expect to get caught, did you? Should we really keep having this pointless conversation?" She didn't answer for a while, just wheezed and sobbed quietly. "I've always wondered why cheaters cry when they get caught. It's a terrible thing. If getting caught is so unpleasant, maybe Mark cheat in the first place." After about 10 minutes, she finally came downstairs, dressed, but without her suitcase. "Evan, honey, she started. But that's when I heard her parents pull up in front of the house. "Goodbye, Laura," I said, holding the door open for her like a gentleman. I echoed Tom's sentiment, telling him that I was just as shocked by how things had unfolded. I explained that Susan had moved in with Henry Miller, and Tom was floored, asking if it was the same Henry from Miller Construction. I confirmed it was indeed the same guy and mentioned that I suspected she was in love with him. Tom then asked me what I planned to do next, and I told him I was going to give her the divorce she wanted since she didn't ask for anything from me. I also told him there was another form she wanted me to sign, but I'd already thrown it out. Curious, Tom asked what the form was, and I explained it was an adoption form. She wanted me to let him adopt the kids. That, I emphasized, was never going to happen. Tom shook his head in disgust and muttered something about Miller. I added that I had been scheduled to start working for him on Monday, but after all this, I decided to find another job instead. In the end, I signed the divorce papers, despite Susan's attempts to talk me out of it. She eventually gave up. When the divorce was finalized, Olivia was 10 and Ethan was 8. Part of me wanted to get back at Miller, but I wasn't about to do anything that would land me in jail. I never showed up for work that Monday, and, oddly enough, no one even followed up about it. In a twist of fate, part of my revenge on Miller happened without me lifting a finger. Word spread after my conversation with Tom, and most of the local contractors refused to work with Miller Construction. They didn't like the way he had treated me, so they refused to take on his projects. While Henry managed to find other contractors, the quality of their work wasn't great, and his business started to suffer. 6 months after that, my divorce was final. 3 months later, Susan married Miller. I took care of the kids for a week while they were on their honeymoon. I didn't do it to help them. I just figured a whole week with my kids was better than the limited weekends I usually got. But something Olivia asked me really got to me. "Daddy, why did you send us to live with Mom and Henry?" "What?" I replied, completely taken aback. "I didn't send you anywhere. Your mother took you because she doesn't love me anymore. If it were up to me, you'd have stayed here with me." I made sure to explain that it wasn't my decision and that I planned to talk to Susan about it. When Susan came by to pick up the kids, she seemed happy and tanned, like life had moved on without a hitch. I pulled her aside and told her to stop lying to the kids. I warned her that if she didn't tell them the truth, I would. I made it clear that the kids knew I never wanted her to take them away and that I'd fight for custody if I had to. Susan didn't argue much. She just walked off, frustrated. Life as a single man felt strange after being married for so long. A few friends tried setting me up on dates, but I wasn't interested. I wanted love, but I wasn't ready to dive back into dating. Little did I know, life was about to change. My neighbors, Brian and Sarah, had moved in shortly after Susan left. Their house was a good deal for them, but it needed a lot of work. Sarah worked as a secretary, and Brian was a retired army man. We got along well, and they seemed like a nice couple. We had friendly conversations whenever we sea-bakered paths. But tragedy struck when Brian had a sudden health issue at work. Paramedics arrived quickly, but Brian was pronounced dead on the scene. The autopsy revealed a subdural hematoma as the cause of death. Sarah was left devastated and all alone. I offered her my condolences and, since her parents were on vacation, I walked her home and poured us some drinks. She cried, talked about her plans for the future, and eventually fell a zethamp on my couch. I covered her with a blanket and slept in a chair, just in case she needed me during the night. The next morning, as Sarah was leaving, Susan was dropping off the kids. She threw me a snide comment. "Good to see you're not wasting any time, Mike." "Come on, Susan," I shot back. The poor woman just lost her husband. Susan gave me a look but turned her attention to the kids. Later that day, I explained to them why Sarah had been at the house. Olivia seemed a little sad, and I think Ethan fully understood. Sarah invited me to Brian's funeral, and of course I went. Thankfully, mortgages in the UK are insured, so Sarah wouldn't be left destitute, but that was little comfort considering her loss. When Sarah's parents returned from Europe, they thanked me for looking after her. After the funeral, I assured them that I'd be there for Sarah, as apart from my coworkers, I was pretty much her only friend. I offered to help with small household chores so she could keep the house livable. The next time Susan came to pick up the kids, she stayed in the car, which was fine by me. I had no desire to speak with her. Sarah and I started spending more time together. Not as a couple, but as friends, supporting each other. About a year later, I overheard Ethan talking to Sarah in the garden. I called out to him, telling him not to bother her, but Sarah waved it off, saying it was okay as she hung some laundry on the clothesline. I suggested to Sarah that she join us for dinner that night, and Ethan immediately chimed in, wanting her to come. We all shared a laugh at that. After dinner, Sarah helped me clean up. It was clear she knew her way around the kitchen, and we spent a pleasant evening together. As she was leaving, Olivia smiled at me and asked, "Dad, is Sarah your girlfriend?" I smiled back and said, "No, sweetheart. She's just a friend and a neighbor." But truthfully, I thought to myself how nice it would be if she were my girlfriend, though I kept that to myself, especially around the kids. One Sunday afternoon, Susan came to pick up the kids. I had a feeling they would tell her about Sarah joining us for dinner, and I was right. The next time Susan came, she seemed particularly interested in Sarah. I told her, bluntly, that Sarah was just a friend and that what I did with my life was none of her business. Susan, annoyed, muttered that she hadn't gotten everything she wanted. I reminded her that she left me for a life of luxury with Miller and told her if he wanted kids, he should have his own. I made it clear that I would never let him adopt my children and that he had already taken my wife and wrecked my marriage. Susan pouted and walked away, but I couldn't help but smile, knowing I had gotten under her skin. About a year later, I realized I hadn't seen Sarah in a few weeks, mostly because I had been so busy. My friend Tom had been rewiring a house for a young couple and asked if I could make an offer on a complete plumbing rewire. They accepted, and I was swamped for several weeks, finishing up the job. While working on the house, Tom kept me up to date on the latest news about Miller. Apparently, he was still struggling, forced to use out-of-town workers since the local guys wanted nothing to do with him. Once the house job was finished, I finally had some time to relax. I decided to ask Sarah out for dinner. She agreed, and we set a time for Saturday night. When I picked her up, I was taken aback. She looked stunning. Sarah, petite with her signature pixie-cut hair, wore a dress that perfectly accentuated her slim figure. For the first time, I felt a real attraction to her. Dinner went smoothly, and we spent the evening talking about our lives. As I walked her to her door later, she thanked me for a wonderful night, and before I could even respond, she surprised me with a passionate kiss that left me breathless. Afterward, she suggested we go out again to see where things might lead. She kissed me on the cheek this time and said goodnight. We did go out again, and this time it led to us spending the night together. Despite her small frame, Sarah was incredibly passionate, and it was a night that left me feeling completely fulfilled. Over the next few months, we grew closer. Eventually, Sarah sold her house and moved in with me. My kids were happy to see me dating again, and of course, they told Susan, who was far from thrilled. It didn't bother me, though. She didn't want me, but Sarah did. A year after that first kiss, Sarah and I got married. When the kids told Susan, she just snorted and turned away. Not long after, Sarah and I had 2 boys of our own, Brian and Jacob. By then, my older kids were old enough to visit on their own, which meant less interaction with Susan, a welcome change. Time flew by, and one day Olivia excitedly announced her engagement. Her boyfriend, Ryan, had proposed the night before. As her father, I offered to help with the wedding costs. Olivia initially said they didn't need help because Henry had offered to cover everything on one condition, that he would walk her down the aisle. Olivia refused, and Henry withdrew his offer, leaving her upset. I was furious with Miller for pulling such a stunt. Sarah suggested we use the money from the sale of her house to cover the expenses. I hesitated, not wanting to take her money, but Sarah insisted, so I let Olivia know we would cover the costs. She was overjoyed, and we worked out a budget that covered everything while staying reasonable. The next day, Olivia called to tell me Henry was furious, and Susan wasn't happy either. Not long after, Ethan showed up unexpectedly at our house. He said he needed a break from home because he was tired of hearing his mother and Henry argue all the time. Sarah asked if the arguments were about the wedding, but Ethan revealed it was something else. He mentioned overhearing them in the bedroom, hinting that Henry wasn't performing well. We couldn't help but laugh at the situation, and I felt a bit of satisfaction knowing Susan had left me for someone who couldn't deliver when it mattered. Ethan ended up spending the night to avoid any further drama at home. On Olivia and Ryan's wedding day, Susan's displeasure was clear. Olivia had told her that she and Henry would sit behind Sarah and me during the ceremony, and Susan wasn't thrilled. The church service went smoothly, and I agreed to have Susan sit at the top table for the reception. Henry, meanwhile, sat with Sarah, Jacob, Brian, and Ethan. After the speeches, the caterers cleared some tables to make space for the dancing. Olivia and Ryan led the first dance, and Sarah and I joined them along with Susan and Henry. Later, while at the bar, I noticed Brian and Jacob chatting with one of Olivia's bridesmaids and her kids. Ethan asked Sarah for a dance, and I encouraged him to go for it. That's when Susan approached me, clearly tipsy, and I had a bad feeling about how this would go. She began by making comments about Sarah, remarking on how young she looked despite being a mother of 2. Then, her tone shifted as she criticized Sarah's weight and outfit. I calmly reminded Susan that we were divorced, and she no longer had any right to comment on my life. But Susan continued with her nasty remarks, so I defended my wife, pointing out that Sarah was more of a woman than Susan ever was. I even hinted at the satisfying intimate life I had with Sarah. Susan was stunned into silence just as Henry came over to join the conversation. I told Susan that when she left me, she thought she was upgrading, but whether she was or wasn't didn't matter anymore. I had moved on. I had a loving wife, 4 wonderful children, and a new life, and that was enough for me. I walked away, leaving Susan and Henry standing there. Sarah and I slow danced after that, and she asked me about the conversation at the bar. Instead of explaining right away, I told her to kiss me, promising I'd fill her in later. We shared a kiss, knowing Susan was watching. Afterward, I glanced over and saw Susan turn away to order another drink. As I looked at Sarah, I couldn't help but think how lucky I was to have traded up to something so much better in my life.